My name is Sharan Sethi, and you're watching Swarajya Conversations. A tiny island in the Indo-Pacific has been garnering international attention as a result of a security pact that it has signed with China. The pact could potentially affect the stability of that entire region and the possibility of a free and open Indo-Pacific could be possibly put to a halt. This region was also caught in the crossfire during World War II and other major global conflicts. Uh, these conflicts have happened in the peripheral region of this particular neighborhood that we're talking about. Now, while Solomon Islands Prime Minister Manasseh Sogavare has assured the United States and its allies that there is nothing to worry about, Cleo Paskal, our guest today, says that there are questions worth asking. Cleo, thank you so much for joining us. How are you? A very good evening.
Pleasure. It's very good to see you again. It's always a delight to chat with you.
Always a delight to chat with you too. A little introduction about Cleo. She is a non-resident fellow, senior fellow for the Indo-Pacific at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. She specializes in strategic affairs in the Indo-Pacific. Cleo, you've been following the developments in on this tiny island in the Indo-Pacific called the Solomon Islands. The United States has finally expressed that the developments on these islands vis-a-vis China are very concerning and could potentially threaten the stability of this region. Can you explain what's at stake here?
So this is really the front line now of Chinese political warfare. So the way that the Chinese Communist Party has been expanding to date has mostly been in political warfare. So trying to get a toehold in through the economy initially, many countries all over, and you know this from the Indian Ocean area. The same is true for the Maldives. The same is true for Sri Lanka, Nepal. You've seen this pattern over and over, where they come in through economic development, or so they say. And then that gives them the ability to buy up political leaders and business elite, and then it becomes more of a strategic toehold to the point where they hope that they can gain such an amount of control within the country or else destabilize the country to the point where their chosen partners, their proxies in the country, gain control. And that's essentially what's happened in the Solomon Islands. With the help of India, the Maldives managed to fend off this sort of attack. Sri Lanka is in the process. It's further down the road that the Solomons is heading down, where the Chinese economic engagement and political corruption can lead to a sort of societal collapse. Solomons isn't there yet, but this pattern is replicating. And
Mhm.
the fundamental goal coming out of Beijing really is to create a world where um, countries are beholden to some degree or another to Beijing for their decision making in any major decisions, and so their strategic position, is a conduit for Chinese goals or aspirations, especially throughout the Indo-Pacific. Now, China has shifted over. This is all called political warfare. This is what you get before what's called kinetic warfare, which is where you're shooting at each other or killing each other. Kinetic is sort
Right.
of, the word means energy, right? Um, and India's been a victim of a kinetic attack from China, and the Chinese Communist Party prefers to keep it in the political warfare realm, but if it can't, as we've seen in the Himalayas, it will shift to kinetic. And so it has its sight set on the Solomons. Solomons is very strategically located, as you mentioned. It was a site 80 years ago in August, will be the anniversary of the start of the Guadalcanal campaign. It was one of the most important of World War II for pushing back the Japanese. Um, it If they grab the Solomons, which is off the northeast coast of Australia, they can interdict Australia. And it's worth looking at the Solomons from a Quad context. Um, and China is pretty much making it explicit. There are rumors that Wang Yi, who's the foreign minister for China, will be in the Solomons around May 25th. I'm not sure when this is going to broadcast, but that will be almost exactly the same date as the Quad leaders meeting in Japan and just a few days after the Australian election. So that is a huge statement of just almost a planting of the strategic flag right off the coast of Australia after an election and just about the same time as a Quad meeting. It is really the Chinese are out of the closet on this one. They're very clear about what their the degree of their ambitions.
And no amount of opposition, even from the Australians, seemed to slightly upset or bother the Chinese. But before we go, into details of that, you wrote a piece a few weeks back for the Sunday Guardian where you said China is serious about capturing Taiwan as they needed to break the first island chain. At the same time, Beijing is using its political warfare to try and burrow the second and the third island chains. Can you explain how this works for our viewers who may not be aware of how strategically important the second and the third chains are?
Yes, thank you. So for a long time, and especially since after the end of World War II, there's been an awareness that China, there's these island chains. So the island chains are they're not they're kind of mental constructs of if you draw a line between dots of islands, uh, pretty much vertically through the Pacific. And the first island chain is Japan, Taiwan, Philippines, Malaysia, all the way down sort of to the Straits of Malacca. If you have strategic control along that chain, you can constrain the Chinese on off onto the coast. So my I have a dog with me, and the dog is listening to me talk and is getting very upset. I think at what the Chinese are trying to do. So there's this chain. So if you hear that, just know that the dog is feels the way I do about what's going on. Um, Growls a little bit more than I do, but but the sentiments are similar. Uh, so, in order for China to get out into the Indo-Pacific, to get its massive navy to have free motion across the Indo-Pacific, it has to have freedom through that first island chain, which is one of the reasons why taking out Taiwan or having Taiwan as something they can control and use as a launch point to get off the island chain is incredibly important. Like they, but once you get past Taiwan, what you see is a whole other set of islands all the way down through the Pacific. So Guam, Palau, all the way down through these Pacific Islands, all the way until you get to the Solomons. And if you want to take Taiwan and you want to hold Taiwan, you can't actually only look at it coming from the coast of China out to Taiwan. You need to cut off the resupply coming from the other side as well. So, in order for a Chinese strategy of taking and controlling Taiwan to work, it also needs to have control in all of those Pacific islands so that it can, for example, use a position in the Solomons. For example, a missile installation. There's a lot of talk about China using the Solomons as a naval port, and they could probably do that under the guise of civil military fusion with the fishing fleet. But what they can actually also do is covertly shift in missiles. So you get like a Cuban Missile Crisis type situation, but put those missiles in one of the major pieces of infrastructure. For example, one of the mines that they're working on, and that would make it harder for the Australians to come up safely to defend Taiwan. Similarly, if you
Yeah,
had some of the islands like Palau or some of the other ones, you could kind of make it a little bit harder for the U.S. to come in from behind.
right.
What they would do about Guam, I'm not sure, or Japan. So if you're looking at a whole of picture taking of Taiwan, uh, in order, from a Chinese perspective, in order to lower your risk you need to essentially have taken the Pacific Islands off the map. And you also need to have a plan for India. Because if China is being pulled into the Pacific Ocean and taking Taiwan,
Mhm.
and it doesn't reinforce the Himalayas from a Chinese perspective, that's a good opening for India to regain some of the territory that has been taken from it from China by China over the years,
Right.
right? So we tend to look at Taiwan just as this tiny little self-contained strategic objective. But from a Chinese planning perspective, they have to assume there'll be attempts to resupply from the Pacific Islands, and there will be some sort of activity coming off of the Indian land border as well. So, in that context, the kind of Indian activity and the Pacific Islands activity is very linked, and we and Indian strategists know this very well, and you're starting to see much more interest, open interest, among this Indian strategic community in creating linkages to the Pacific Islands to try to reinforce them in order to make it more difficult for China to achieve its Pacific objectives, which would free it up for its Himalayan objectives.
Looking at all these tensions, is this one of the reasons why you call this decade a decade of concern?
Yeah, so that is. I'm glad you brought that up. I didn't coin that term. That term was coined by Captain James Fennell, was the head of intelligence for the U.S. Pacific Fleet, and he coined it very early on in like around 2012, for
Right.
example. And he saw what how the PLA Navy was developing, and he truly understood the strategic intent coming out of Beijing. And he calculated, based on a bunch of different factors, uh, how China was building towards achieving its goal of 2049. 2049 will be the 100th anniversary of the founding of the PRC, and it is a goal of the overt goal that they reiterate over and over in Beijing for this to have this kind of grand reunification and rejuvenation of the Chinese Middle Kingdom fantasy empire. Um, and in order to get, so working back from 2049, in order to get there and working forward to see how they're building, he identified this decade starting in 2020 as the one when China was most likely to launch attacks to try it would be strong enough, the rest of the world wouldn't be ready, and it would be able to do some pretty forceful things, and then kind of rehabilitate itself in the international community in time for it to be fully accepted and properly worshipped in its own mind by the time of 2049. It is a very convincing and compelling assessment, and I think that we're seeing it come to fruition earlier in the decade than we had feared because of some of the other factors that have, the withdrawal of Afghanistan and what's going on in Ukraine and stuff have opened up this window even earlier than we expected. But yes, it's very much this decade of concern. This the Fennell window, I think, as it should be called, has opened, and we're seeing what's coming through already.
There is definitely a very concerning pattern emerging. Let me take you back to earlier this year, on January 1st, specifically, when you wrote another piece for the Sunday Guardian, where you summarized the Chinese activities across the world in 2021. And you said that the Chinese had a blast that year, and you've already written that 2022 is going to be a major year for China as they advance towards other strategic goals. So, what do they have in mind, especially since we already see the developments in Solomon Islands?
So if they succeed in Solomon's is kind of a mini case, and
Right.
it's sort of a testing of the international community's will. Um, it's not a big country. It's about 6 or 7 lakh people. It's spread out over many different islands. It's normally it has an enormous amount of potential, um, but it's not a Taiwan, which has 24, 26 million people. But ideologically, it's kind of a similar situation where you have a democracy that's in the process of being subverted and then taken over. And if we kind of the part of the world that cares about democracy, accountability, transparency, rule of law, can't put together a plan to help the people of the Solomon Islands, then it's a pretty big indication that we aren't ready to fight, or we don't know how to fight in countless other locations. And leaders with authoritarian tendencies across the world. I mean, we're talking about the Indo-Pacific, but the same is true in Latin America and in Africa, where China's replicating these same patterns. Um, have a will have a good model to work from. Prime Minister Sogavare gets his way and manages to tie up this deal with the Chinese, and I think he also wants to postpone upcoming elections. Uh, then other people who are like him and who will justify it by saying the West is terrible and we've gotten a raw deal from the U.S. and why don't we try this Chinese option and look at how much development they're doing and all that all the usual um, justifications, rationalizations.
Right.
Um, they'll be emboldened. So, you know, what will happen this year? I don't know what will happen this year, but the time is now to try to start to close that window on the decade of concern, because it's starting earlier, harder, faster, and more overt than anybody expected. And we should be able to do it. The people of the Solomons don't want this deal, right? We're talking about maybe a dozen people at the top who are benefiting from this deal. That's it.
This is one of the reasons
So,
why there were anti-government protests in the Solomon Islands.
it was one of the reasons. Um, there were, and then that was used as the peaceful protests they then shot tear gas into the crowd. There was some opportunistic looting. There was burning of the Chinatown. That then became a justification for inviting in Chinese security forces. So these things, every move that you might make that you think is a democratic or positive move, somebody in Beijing has already gamed out how to turn that to their advantage. And by the time that these big moves are made, like a security deal, they've already put in place multiple warfares, including put in people in the media that are very compliant. Social media levers have been pulled. The legal system, in many cases, has been corrupted. Um, and there's a psychological warfare component that goes on as well. These are the three warfares: the media, the lawfare, and the psychological warfare. It's pretty standard. So by the time these actions are taken, it's that's just the visible tip of an iceberg of penetration and corruption that's been going on for long enough for China to think they can pull the lever now
Right.
and switch it over.
You were also mentioning some of the activities that are concerning the strategic experts in India, and many of these experts have also been expressing their concerns over the predatory economics and the policies that China has been pursuing in India's own neighborhood. And we've seen that come to fruition, especially after Sri Lanka declared a state of emergency. But before that, even the common man in India, I don't think they were aware of what exactly was happening vis-a-vis China in Sri Lanka. Uh, what can countries, especially the vulnerable ones, like Solomon Islands, which have no massive armies or populations to defend itself, do against predatory countries which have policies, like China, for that matter.
So India is uniquely placed to be helpful in this sphere because after the ambush and murder of the soldiers, the 20 soldiers in Galwan, one of the first things India did, is within 2 weeks, was ban 59 Chinese apps. Now, that shows an understanding of how China wages political warfare that is more advanced than anybody else. I mean, not just understanding, but willingness to take action. Nobody else has done that. So the expertise that is in the Indian strategic community about the nature of the threat and how to effectively counter the threat is something that would be very helpful to many countries if it were shared. Because coming from a Western nation, you know, there's it's very easy to present it as hypocritical. To cut for somebody to go from the U.S. to go to the Solomons and say this is what you should do. And the U.S. hasn't banned TikTok and WhatsApp. Similarly, in terms of getting bypassing that initial Chinese entry, which is through economics, India is better placed than the other three Quad partners to bolster the economy of a place like the Solomons, because the economies are very similar. So, in the same way that low cost pharmaceuticals or telemedicine or education or electric vehicles or any of that kind of the whole huge range of affordable things that India has pioneered in order for its own growth, those are all the things you need in the Solomons. So Solomons, for example, had a really terrible COVID outbreak recently, and it could have used some of the techniques, technologies, and approaches that were used in UP. But what they got was, very centralized, you know, Western style vaccination program that didn't include some of the other elements that can be helpful out in the villages, as has been proven in India. So that's kind of a very clear example of how Indian engagement, and it doesn't India, has over a billion whatever of its own people it needs to take care of. Everybody knows that. We're not talking about charity.
Right.
The people of the Solomons buy stuff. They buy medicine. They buy school books. They pay for all this stuff. But the Indian stuff is as good quality, much more affordable, and often even just packaged in a more viable way. I mean, like for example, in Indian on those little shops in on the street, you can buy those little pieces of soap, right? So if you don't have enough money for a big bar of soap, you can buy a little bar of soap, and that'll be enough for the job interview to get you to school for the week or whatever. That's the sort of approach that people in places like the Solomons would really appreciate.
Right.
So, yeah, and that's not charity. That's just creating those business linkages that leave both sides totally satisfied and leave very little room for China.
Islanders do have a
Um,
lot of dignity and self respect, and the Chinese are violating that, which is why there is some sort of a resistance, is what you're saying, especially in Solomon Islands. In that sense, do you think an initiative like AUKUS may be a solution to this? Do you think the United States can actually stand up to the Chinese and Solomon Islands? Especially, I ask you this because of their Afghanistan debacle and what's happening in Ukraine right now. And I think as we speak, Sweden and Finland have announced that they join NATO.
yeah, so AUKUS is very much of a military, obviously, um, uh, focus. So it's around nuclear subs, but also a lot of other technologies. But a lot of it's about military technologies, and that is designed, and hopefully it will create. expand a zone of strategic security, military security. But currently, the war that is being fought is a political warfare battle. So you want to avoid getting to the point where you need to use the nuclear submarines. And you're not going to dislodge the Chinese from the Solomons by shooting missiles at them at this point. But you can start to dislodge them by having investigative reporters look at corruption in the government, and all of their warfares that they've identified as a form of attack, lawfare, media, and psychological. If they think that that's a valid form of attack, that's also something that you can use to attack them, right? So they're identifying not just points of attack, but also their own vulnerabilities.
Right.
So if you flip the tables on them and give the Solomon Islanders the strength and the support and the knowledge to fight their own political warfare battles. I mean, this is one of the reasons why I'm so grateful to the Sunday Guardian, for example, for publishing these pieces, is because it gave a lot of the pieces are just direct interviews with people from the Solomons, and they know the situation better than anybody else. And so it lets them get the word out about their situation, which makes it harder for the Chinese. So I'd much prefer at this stage to see 5 really good investigative journalists funded in the Solomons than 5 nuclear warheads floating around off the coast. We might need it later on, but right now it's the investigative journalists that can actually do the most damage.
Absolutely. I mean, thanks to people like you, even the common man in a far off country, has been able to learn about what's been happening on a tiny island in the Pacific. But I enjoy these conversations, and I hope you can join me for more of these conversations in the future. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure. Thank you, and thanks to whoever's still watching for watching. I'm truly grateful for your interest. Thank you.